Hello, welcome to the video lecture series on digital image processing. In our last lecture, we have talked about image restoration, image registration problem. So, we have talked about different image mismatch or match measures. We have talked about the cross correlation between two images, and we have also seen some application of registration techniques. Now, including this image registration technique, whatever we have done till now in our digital image processing course, you have seen that all our discussions are mainly based on black and white images. That is, we have not considered any color image during our discussion. Now, starting from today and coming few lectures, we will talk about the color image processing. So, today what we are going to do is, we are going to introduce the concept of color image processing. We are going to see that what are primary and secondary colors. We are going to talk about color characteristics. Then we will see chromaticity diagram and how the chromaticity diagram can be used to specify a color. We will see two color models. One of them is RGB color model or red, green and blue color model, and other one is HSI color model. And we will also see that how we can convert from one color model to another color model. Now, first let us talk about why we want color image processing when we get information from black and white images itself. The reason is, color is a very powerful descriptor, and using the color information we can extract the objects of interest from an image very easily, which is not so easy in some cases using black and white or simple gray level image. And the second motivation why we go for color image processing is that, or we talk about color images, is that human eyes can distinguish between thousands of colors and color shades, whereas when we talk about only black and white image or grayscale image, we can distinguish only about 2 dozens of intensity distributions or different gray shades. So, that is the reason that color image processing is a very important topic. Firstly, because we can distinguish between more number of colors, and secondly, we can identify some objects in a color image very easily, which otherwise may be difficult from a simple intensity image or a gray level image. Now, coming to color image processing, there are two major areas. One of the area we call as full color image processing. We say full color processing, and other area is pseudo color processing. Now, what is meant by this full color processing or pseudo color processing? When we talk about full color processing, the images which are acquired by full color TV camera or by a full color scanner, then you find that almost all the colors that we can perceive, they are present in the images. So, that is what is meant by a full color image, and when we try to process such a full color image, what we will try to process is we will take into consideration all those colors which are present in the image. Whereas, when we talk about this pseudo color processing, the pseudo color processing is a problem where we try to assign certain colors to a range of gray levels. When we take an intensity image or simply a black and white image which has intensity levels from say 0 to 255, what I can do is we can divide this entire intensity range into a number of sub range. Say for example, I can divide 0 to say 50, this intensity level will be in one range, maybe 50 to 100 intensity levels will be in another range, and to this range I can assign one particular color, whereas in this range 50 to 100 I can assign another particular color. And this pseudo color image processing is mostly useful for human interpretation. So, as we said that we can hardly distinguish around 2 dozens of intensity of gray shades, whereas if we go for so in such cases it may not be possible for us to distinguish between two gray regions which are very near to each other, where the intensity values are very near to each other. So, in such cases if we go for this pseudo coloring technique, that is we assign different colors to different range of intensity values, then from the same intensity image or black and white image we can extract the information much more easily, and this is mainly useful, as I said, for human interpretation purpose. Now, what is the problem with the color image processing? The interpretation of color as the color is interpreted by the human beings, this problem is a physiological problem, and we have not yet been fully understand what is the mechanism by which we really interpret a color. So, though the mechanism is not fully understood, but the physical nature of color we can represent formally, we can express it formally, and our formal expression is really supported by some experimental results. Now, the concept of color is not very new. You know from your school level physics, from school level optics, that way back in 1666, it was Newton who discovered the color spectrum. So, what he did is his experimental setup was something like this. You have an optical prism and you pass white light through this optical prism, and as the white light passes through the optical prism, on the other side, when this white light comes out of it, the light does not remain white anymore. However, it is broken into a number of color components which is known as spectrum. So, as has been shown in this particular diagram, you find that at one end of the spectrum, what we have is the violet. At one end we have the violet, and at the other end we have the red color. So, the color components that vary from violet to red, and this was really discovered by Newton way back in 1666. Now, the thing is, how do we perceive color, or how do I say that an object is of a particular color? We have seen earlier that we perceive an object, we see an object because light falls on the object, or the object is illuminated by certain source of light. The light gets reflected from the object, it reaches our eye, then only we can see the object. Similarly, we can perceive the color depending upon the nature of the light which is reflected by the object surface. So, because we have to perceive this nature of the light, so we have to see that what is the spectrum of light which is, or the spectrum of the energy which is really in the visible range, because it is only in the visible range that we are able to perceive any color. So, if you consider the electromagnetic spectrum, so as shown here, the complete electromagnetic spectrum ranges from gamma rays to radio frequency waves. And you find that this visible spectrum, the visible light spectrum, it occupies only a very narrow range of frequencies in this entire electromagnetic spectrum. And here you find that the wavelength of the visible spectrum, that roughly varies from say 400 nanometer to 700 nanometer. So, at one end it is around 400 nanometer wavelength, and at the other end it is around 700 nanometer in wavelength. So, whenever a light falls on an object, and if the object reflects lights of all wavelengths in this visible spectrum in a balanced manner, that is, all the wavelengths are reflected in the appropriate proportion, in that case that object will be appearing as an white object. And depending upon the wavelength, predominant wavelength within this visible spectrum, the object will appear to be a colored object, and the object color will depend upon what is the wavelength of light that is predominantly reflected by that particular object surface. Now, coming to the attributes of light, if we have an achromatic light, that means a light which does not contain any color component, the only attribute which describes that particular light is the intensity of the light. Whereas, if it is a chromatic light, in that case, as we have just seen, the wavelength of the chromatic light within the visible range can vary from roughly 400 nanometer to 700 nanometer. Now, there are basically three quantities which describe the quality of light. So, what are those quantities? One of the quantity is what is called radiance, the second quantity is called luminance, and the third quantity is called brightness. So, we have these three quantities, radiance, luminance and brightness, which basically describe what is the quality of light. Now, what is this radiance? Radiance is the total amount of energy which comes out of a light source, and as this is the total amount of energy, so this radiance is to be measured in the form of in units of watts. Whereas, luminance, it is the amount of energy that is perceived by an observer. So, you find the difference between the radiance and luminance. Radiance is the total amount of energy which comes out of a light source, whereas luminance is the amount of energy which is perceived by an observer. So, as the radiance is measured in units of watts, it is luminance which is measured in units of what is called lumens. Whereas, the third quantity, that is brightness, it is actually a subjective measure, and it is practically not possible to measure the amount of brightness. So, though we can measure the radiance and luminance, but practically we cannot measure what is brightness. Now, again coming to our color images or color lights, most of you must be aware that when we consider colors or when we talk about colors, we normally talk about three primary colors, and we say that the three primary colors are red, green and blue. So, we consider the primary colors of light, colored light. So, we consider the primary colors to be red, green and blue. So, we consider these three colors to be the primary colors, and normally we represent it as R, G and B. Now, we find that from the spectrum which was discovered by Newton, there are actually 7 different colors, but out of those 7 colors, we have chosen only these 3 different colors, red, green and blue, to be the primary colors, and we assume that by mixing these primary colors in different proportions, we can generate all other colors. Now, why do we choose these 3 colors to be the primary colors? The reason is something like this, that actually there are some cone cells in our eyes which are responsible for color sensation. So, there are around 6 to 7 million cone cells, which are really responsible for color sensation. Now, out of these 6 to 7 million cone cells, around 65% of the cone cells, they are sensitive to red light, 33% of the cone cells are sensitive to, they sense green lights, and roughly 2% of the cone cells, they sense blue lights. So, because of the presence of these 3 different cone cells in our eyes, which sense red, green and blue, these 3 color components. So, we consider red, green and blue to be our primary colors, and we assume that by mixing these primary colors in appropriate proportion, we are able to generate all other different colors. Now, as per this, CIE standard specified 3 different wavelengths for 3 different colors. So, CIE specified red to have an wavelength of 700 nanometer, green to have an wavelength of 546.1 nanometer, and blue to be an wavelength of 435.8 nanometer. But the experimental result is slightly different from this. Let us see how the experimental result looks like. This diagram shows the sensitivity of those 3 different cones in our eyes that we have just said. So, you find that the cones which are sensitive to blue light, to blue color, these cones actually receive wavelengths ranging from around 400 nanometer to 550 nanometer. Whereas, the cones which are sensitive to green lights, they are sensitive to wavelengths ranging from slightly higher than 400 nanometer to an wavelength of something around say 650 nanometer. Whereas, the cones which are sensitive to red light, they are sensitive to wavelengths starting from 450 nanometer to around 700 nanometer. Though the sensitivity is maximum for this type of cones, say blue cone is maximally sensitive at an wavelength of 445 nanometer, as is shown in this diagram. So, as is shown in this diagram, you find that the blue cells, the blue cones, they are most sensitive to an wavelength of 445 nanometer. The green cones are most sensitive to an wavelength of 535 nanometer, whereas the red cones are most sensitive to an wavelength of 575 nanometer. So, these experimental figures are slightly different from what was specified by CIE, and one point has to be kept in mind that though CIE standard specifies red, green and blue to be of certain wavelength, but no single wavelength can specify any particular color. In fact, from the visible spectrum, from the visible domain of the spectrum that we have just seen, it is quite clear that when we consider two spectrum colors, two adjacent spectrum colors, there is no clear cut boundary between those two adjacent spectrum colors. Rather, one color slowly or smoothly gets merged into the other color. So, as you can see from the same diagram, that whenever we have a transition from say green to yellow, you find that we do not have any clear cut boundary between green and yellow. Similarly, whenever there is a transition from say yellow to red, the boundary is not clearly defined, but we have a smooth transition from one color to another color. So, that clearly says that no single color may be called, or no single wavelength may be called red, green or blue, but it is a band of wavelengths which give you color sensation, a band of wavelengths that gives you green color sensation, a band of wavelengths that give you red color sensation, at the same time a band of wavelengths that give you say blue color sensation. So, having specific wavelengths as standard does not mean that these fixed RGB components alone when mixed properly will generate all other colors, but rather we should have a flexibility that we should also allow the wavelengths of these three different colors to change, because as we have just seen that green actually specifies a band of wavelengths, red actually specifies a band of wavelengths. Similarly, blue also specifies a band of wavelengths. So, to generate all possible colors, we should allow the wavelengths of these colors are red, green and blue also to change. Now, when I say that these are the different primary colors, that is red, green and blue, mixing of the primary colors generate the secondary colors. So, when we mix say red and blue, if we mix red and blue, you find that both red and blue, they are the primary colors. Red and blue will generate a color called magenta, which is a secondary color. Similarly, if we mix green and blue, this will generate a color which is called cyan, and if we mix red and green, if we mix red and green, these two generate color yellow. So, as we have said that red, green and blue, we consider these three colors as primary colors. By mixing the primary colors, we generate the secondary colors. So, these three colors, magenta, cyan and yellow, they will be called secondary colors of light. Now, here another important concept is the pigments. As we have said that red, green and blue are the primary colors of light, and if we mix these colors, we generate the secondary colors of light, which for example, are magenta, cyan and yellow. When it comes to the pigments, the primary color of a pigment is defined as an wavelength which is absorbed by the pigment and it reflects the other two wavelengths. So, the primary color of light should be the opposite of the primary color of a pigment. So, as red, green and blue, they are the primary colors of light, whereas magenta, cyan and yellow, they are the primary colors of a pigment. So, when it comes to pigment, we will consider this magenta, cyan and yellow, they are to be the primary colors. So, these are the primary colors for pigments. And in the same manner, this red, green and blue, which are the primary colors of light, these three will be the secondary colors for pigments. And as we have seen that for the colors of light, the primary colors of light, if we mix red, green and blue in appropriate proportion, we generate white light. Similarly, for the pigments, if we mix the cyan, magenta and yellow in appropriate proportion, we will generate the black color. So, for pigments, appropriate mixing of the primary colors will generate black, whereas for light, the appropriate mixing of the primary colors will generate white. Now, so far what we have discussed, that is the primary colors of light, which are red, green and blue, or the primary colors of pigments, which are magenta, cyan and yellow. These are the concepts or the color components we consider when we talk about the color reproduction, or these are from the hardware point of view. That is for a camera or for a display device, for a scanner, for a printer, we talk about these primary color components. But when we perceive a color as human being, and when we look at a color, we do not really think that how much of red component or how much of blue component or how much of green component that particular color has. But the way we try to distinguish the color is based on the characteristics which are called brightness, hue and saturation. So, for us, for the perception purpose, the color components will be taken as, or the characteristics are brightness, hue and saturation, instead of the red, green and blue or cyan, magenta and yellow. Now, let us see that what does these three attributes mean. So, what is brightness? Brightness is nothing but a chromatic notion of intensity. As we have seen that in case of a black and white image, we talk about the intensity. Similarly, for a color image, there is a chromatic notion of intensity. It is not really intensity, which we call as bright or brightness. Similarly, hue, it represents the dominant wavelength in a mixture of colors. So, when you look at a secondary color, which is a mixture of different primary colors, there will be one wavelength which is a dominant one, dominant wavelength, and the overall sensation of that particular secondary color will be determined by the dominant wavelength. So, this hue, this particular attribute, it indicates that what is the dominant wavelength present in a mixture of colors. Similarly, the other term saturation, you find that whenever we talk about a particular color red, there may be various shades of red. So, this saturation indicates that what is the purity of that particular color, or in other words, what is the amount of light which has been mixed to that particular color to make it a diluted one. So, these are basically the three different attributes which we normally use to distinguish one color from another color. Now, coming to the spectrum colors, because the spectrum colors are not diluted, there is no white light, white component added to a spectrum color. So, spectrum colors are fully saturated, whereas if we take any other color which is not a spectrum color, say for example, if we consider a color say pink. Pink is nothing but a mixing of white with red. So, red plus white, this makes a pink color. So, red is a fully saturated color because it is a spectrum color and there is no white light mixed in red, but if we mix white light with red, the color generated is pink. So, pink color is not fully saturated, but red is fully saturated. So, we have these three concepts for color perception, that is hue and saturation, and the other one is brightness. And as we said that brightness indicates a chromatic notion of the intensity, whereas hue and saturation, they gives you the color sensation. So, we say that hue and saturation together, they indicates what is the chromaticity of the light, whereas this brightness gives you some sensation of intensity. So, using this hue, saturation of intensity, what we are trying to do is we are separating the brightness part and the chromaticity part. So, whenever we try to perceive a particular color, we normally perceive it in the form of hue, saturation and brightness, whereas from the point of view of hardware, it is the red, green and blue or magenta, cyan and yellow, which are more appropriate to describe the color. Now, the amount of light or the amount of red, green and blue lights which are required to form any particular color is called a tri-stimulus. We call it tri-stimulus. And obviously, because this indicates what is the amount of red light, green light and blue light which are to be mixed to form any particular color. So, this will have three components, one is x component, y component and z component. And a color is normally specified by what is called chromatic coefficients. So, we call them as chromatic coefficients. And these chromatic coefficients are obtained as the coefficient for red is given by x lowercase x is equal to capital X by capital X plus capital Y plus capital Z. So, this capital X is the amount of red light, capital Y is the amount of green light and capital Z is the amount of blue light which are to be mixed to form a particular color. So, the chromatic coefficient for red which is given by lowercase x, which is computed like this. Similarly, chromatic coefficient for green is computed as lowercase y is equal to capital Y by capital X plus capital Y plus capital Z, and similarly for blue it is capital Z by capital X plus capital Y plus capital Z. So, this lowercase x, y, z, these are called the chromatic coefficients of a particular color. So, whenever we want to specify a color, we have to specify it by its chromatic coefficients. And from here you find that this sum of the chromatic coefficients, that is lowercase x plus lowercase y plus lowercase z is equal to 0 is equal to 1. So, this is represented in normalized form. So, as any color can be specified by its chromatic coefficients, in the same manner there is another way in which a color can be specified, that is with the help of what is known as a CIE chromaticity diagram. So, a color can be specified both by its chromatic coefficients as well as it can be specified with the help of a chromaticity diagram. So, let us see what is this chromaticity diagram. So, here we have shown this chromaticity diagram, and you find that it is a color diagram in a two-dimensional space. We have the horizontal axis, which is the lowercase, which is the axis representing the lowercase x, and we have the vertical axis, which is the axis representing lowercase y. That means, the chromatic coefficient for red is along the horizontal axis and the chromatic coefficient for green is along the vertical axis. And if we want to specify any particular color, say for example, I take this particular point and I want to find out that how this particular color can be, say here, how this particular color can be specified. So, as we have said that we can specify it by its chromatic coefficients. Now, two of the components of the chromatic coefficients, that is x and y, that is red component and green component, we can get from the horizontal axis and the vertical axis, and the third component, that is z, obviously in this case will be given by z is equal to 1 minus x plus y. So, x and y I obtain from this chromaticity diagram, and I can get the chromatic coefficient component z simply by using the relation that x plus y plus z is equal to 1. And if you study this chromaticity diagram, you find that all the spectral colors, they are represented along the boundary of this chromaticity diagram. Okay. So, along the boundary we have all the spectral colors. In this chromaticity diagram, there is a point which is marked as say this point, which is marked as point of equal energy. That means, all the red, green and blue components, they are mixed in equal proportion, and this is the one which is the CIE standard of white. Okay. And as we said, the notion of saturation, you find that all the points on the boundary, because they are the spectrum colors, so all the colors along the boundary, they are fully saturated. And as we move inside the chromaticity diagram away from the boundary, as we move away from the boundary, the color becomes less and less saturated. So, one use of this chromaticity diagram is that we can specify a color using this chromaticity diagram. We can find out what are the chromatic coefficients x, y and z by using this chromaticity diagram. And not only that, this chromaticity diagram is also useful for color mixing. Let us see how. Say for example, within this I take two color points. Say I take one color point somewhere here and I take one point somewhere here and I consider another point somewhere here. And if I join these 2 points by a straight line, say like this, in that case this straight line indicates that what are the different colors that I can generate by mixing the color present at this location and the color present at this location. So, all possible mixture of these two colors can create all the colors which are lying on this straight line segment connecting these two color points. And same is true for 3 points. So, instead of just taking these two points, if I take a third point somewhere here, then you form a triangle connecting these 3 color points. Then if I take the color present at this location, the color present at this location and the color which is specified at this location, and by mixing all these 3 colors in different proportions, I can generate all the colors lying within this rectangular region. So, this chromaticity diagram is also very helpful for color mixing operation. For example, we can get some other information from this chromaticity diagram like this. So, as we have said that we have this point of equal energy, which is the CIE standard of white. Now, if I take any color point on the boundary of this chromaticity diagram, which we said that this is nothing but a color which is fully saturated, and we mentioned that is as we move away from this boundary, the colors that we get, they are getting less and less saturated, and saturation at the point of equal energy, which is the CIE standard of white, just we have said, here the saturation is 0, the point is not saturated at all. Now, if I draw a straight line from any of these boundaries joining this point of equal energy like this. Okay. So, this indicates that what are the different shades of color of this particular saturated color that we can obtain by mixing white light to this saturated color. So, as we have said that as we mix white light, the saturation goes on decreasing, that is we can generate different shades of any particular color. So, this particular straight line which connects the point of equal energy, which is nothing but the CIE standard of white, and a color on the boundary which is a fully saturated color, then what I can get is all the shades of this particular color is actually lying on this particular straight line, which joins the boundary point to the point of equal energy. So, you find that using this chromaticity diagram, we can generate different colors. We can find out that in what proportion the red, green and blue, they must be mixed, so that we can generate any particular color. And this we can do for 2 colors, mixing of 2 colors, we can use it for mixing of 3 colors and so on. Now, just to mention that as we have said that we have taken red, green and blue as primary colors, you find that in this chromaticity diagram, your green is, if I take green to be somewhere here, so if I consider this point to be the green point, so this point is the red point and the blue is somewhere here, and if I join these 3 points by straight lines, what I get is a rectangle. So, by using this red, green and blue, I can generate, as we have just discussed, all the colors which are present within this triangular region. So, as this triangular region does not encompass the entire part of this chromaticity diagram, because this chromaticity diagram is not really a triangular diagram. So, just we have said that using 3 fixed wavelengths as red, green and blue, we cannot generate all the colors in the visible region, and that is also quite obvious from this chromaticity diagram, because if we consider only 3 fixed wavelengths to represent red, green and blue points, using those 3 wavelengths we can just form a triangular region, and none of the triangular regions, single triangular region can fully encompass the chromaticity diagram. So, as a result of that, by using fixed wavelengths for red, green and blue as primary colors, cannot generate all the colors as given in this chromaticity diagram. But still, using the chromaticity diagram, we can have many informations, many useful informations. As we have said that we can go for color mixing, we can find out different shades of color, we can specify a color and so on. Now, coming to this next topic, that is color model. Now, we need a color model to specify a particular color. A color model helps us to specify a particular color in a standard way. Now, what is a color model? color model is actually a space, or we can represent it as a coordinate system within which any specified color will be represented by a single point. Now, as we have said that we have two ways of describing a color. One is by using the RGB model, by using the red, green and blue components, or cyan, yellow and magenta component, which are from the hardware point of view, and similarly from the perception point of view, we have to consider the hue, saturation and brightness. So, considering these two aspects, we can generate two different color models, two types of color models. One color model is oriented towards hardware, that is the color display device or color scanner device or color printer, and the other color model is to cater for to take care of the human perception aspect, and we will see that this will not only take care of the human perception aspect, it is also useful for application purpose. So, accordingly, we can have a number of different color models. One of the color model we will call as RGB model or red, green, blue model, and the other color model is cyan, magenta and yellow, and there is an extension of this, that is CMYK, that is cyan, magenta, yellow and black. This RGB color model, this is useful for image displays like monitor. CMY or CMYK color model, these are useful for image printers. And you find that both these color models are hardware oriented. Because both of them try to specify color using the components as primary color components, either red, green and blue or cyan, magenta and yellow. And as we have said that red, green and blue, they are the primary colors of light, whereas cyan, magenta and yellow, they are the primary colors of pigments. And the other color model that we will also consider is HSI color model, that is hue, saturation and intensity or brightness. And this HSI color model, it is application oriented or also it is perception oriented, that is how we perceive a particular color. And we have also discussed that this HSI color model, this actually decouples the color from the grayscale information. So, we have said that this I part, this actually gives you the grayscale information, whereas hue and saturation taken together gives you the chromatic information. So, because of this, as in HSI model, we are decoupling the intensity information from the chromatic information. So, the advantage that we get is many of the applications or the algorithms which are actually developed for grayscale images, they can also be applied in case of color images, because here we are decoupling the color from the intensity. So, all the intensity oriented all the algorithms which are actually developed for grayscale images can also be applied on the intensity component or I component of this color image. Now, first let us discuss about the RGB model. So, we will talk about RGB color model first. As we have said that in case of RGB, a color image is represented by three primary components, and the primary components are red, green and blue. So, these are the three components, three color components which when mixed in proper form in appropriate proportion, this generates all possible colors. So, our RGB color model is based on Cartesian coordinate system, and we will see in this diagram that this shows diagrammatically an RGB color model that we normally use. So, you find that this RGB color model is based on the Cartesian coordinate system, where the red, green and blue R, G and B, these components are placed along the coordinate axis, and the red component is placed at location 1, 0, 0 as shown in this diagram. So, this is the location which contains the red, this is the location 0, 1, 0 which is the green point, and 0, 0, 1 this is the blue point. So, we have this red point and green point and blue point, they are along three corners of a cube in this RGB in this Cartesian coordinate system. Similarly, cyan, magenta and yellow, they are at other three corners in this cube. Now, here let me mention that this model which is represented, it is in the normalized form, that is all the three color components, that is red, green and blue, they are varying within the range 0 to 1. So, all these color components are represented in a normalized form. Similarly, the cyan, magenta and yellow, they are also represented in normalized form. Now, the origin of this color model, that is at location 0, 0, 0, this represents black, and the furthest vertex, that is 1, 1, 1, that represents white. And you find that if I join a straight line connecting the origin to this white point, so this straight line actually represents a grayscale, and we also call it an intensity axis. So, as you move from the origin which is black to the furthest vertex in this cube which is white, what we will generate is different intensity values. Okay. So, as a result of this, we also call it the intensity axis or grayscale axis. So, we stop our discussions today. We have just introduced the RGB color model, and we will continue with our discussion in our next class. Now, let us have some questions on today's lecture. So, the first question is, how do we perceive color? The second question, what is the difference between luminance and radiance? The third question is, why red, green and blue are generally accepted as primary colors, which when mixed in appropriate proportions generate other colors? The fourth question, what are pigment primary colors? The fifth, what are meant by hue and saturation? Thank you.